So today I was browsing Reddit as I normally do, and I decided since it's October I wanted to look up something creepy, and I came across this Ask Reddit thread: what is the creepiest unsolved mystery? And in contrast to something we looked at a couple weeks ago, which was people's personal experiences that they thought people wouldn't believe if they told them about it, these are actual documented occurrences that are just completely unexplained and have been left unsolved. So let's get right into the stories. A creepy one off the top of my head is the harassment of Bill and Dorothy Wacker, an elderly couple from Ohio. Their house had been ransacked a couple of times between 1984 and 1985. Then, in July of 1985, a stranger knocked on their door while Dorothy was home alone, recovering from heart surgery. The stranger asked to use their phone due to his car apparently breaking down. She thought he'd left after making the call, but then was knocked unconscious by a blow to the head. Dorothy woke up bound and gagged on the kitchen floor, but thankfully managed to crawl to an open window and get help from her neighbors, who called the police. Ben then returned home to find his revolver, among a few other things, had been stolen. This was accompanied by the message "cheaper but will do" scrawled in crayon on one of their walls. 4 months later, the revolver turned up on their porch in a bag. The harasser repeatedly phoned the couple, sometimes threatening them, and sometimes just breathing deeply down the phone like a creep. Despite changing their phone number multiple times, they were unable to stop the calls. After this, they installed security lights. The harasser responded with a note saying, "Your lights are a laugh." They were frequently left other mocking and scary notes. Dorothy was then attacked once more in 1993, a full 8 years after the original attack, this time being sent to the hospital with skull lacerations. The Wackers staked out their own house after this in an attempt to find the person who had been harassing them. However, they didn't find anything. After the stakeout had been called off, they heard banging at the side of their house and found a note simply saying, "Get the message." After this, as far as I can recall, the harassment abruptly stopped. It really freaks me out. What motive would one have to harass a random old couple for years and years? They never even got close to finding out who did it, and both Bill and Dorothy died without ever finding out who made their lives hell. The only possible motive I could think of is some insane person that had some delusion that the Wackers were evil or were out to get them or something, because it just seems unexplainable aside from that. And luckily, nowadays, with camera technology being more available, you might be able to detect who was doing this to you, but that didn't make anything better for the Wackers at the time. This is incredibly sad. My favorite is probably John Lang's case. Basically, a local activist posts regularly about the Fresno Police Department and how they were plotting against him. People thought he was crazy until he set up a camera that recorded lots of weird stuff, including a bunch of cops parking across the street from his house and staring at him in the middle of the night, and a van pulling up with a large camera that people theorized took thermal pictures through walls to see if anyone was inside. He posted that that weekend, the police were going to murder him and accurately predicted his death. The police released a report saying that he was stabbed repeatedly in the back, and then recanted, saying it was supposedly a suicide of a crazy man. I don't know of many suicides that occur from somebody stabbing themselves repeatedly in the back, but what I do know is, as scary as it might be, sometimes a person can know something that certain entities don't want them to know. You can stumble across something occurring, or stumble across some sort of information that can make you a target, and it seems like John Lang was one of those targets. Antoinette Cayadito's kidnapping. She let her kidnapper in after he said that he was Uncle Joe, and then they threw her into a van. The creepy part is that a year later, someone called 911 claiming to be her, and someone shouts in the background, "Who said you could use the phone?" and a struggle is heard before the call cuts off. Antoinette's mom said that she was sure it was her daughter's voice. Then, 4 years later, a girl matching Antoinette's description was acting strange in a diner, and left a note on a napkin that said, "Please help, call police." She's still missing, and she went missing in 1986. A reply on this comment leaves a theory. There's a strong belief amongst the locals/true crime fans that the mother set her daughter up to be taken. The mom, who was dirt poor raising 3 kids, somehow had enough money to buy a sports car after her daughter disappeared. Police believe the mom was heavily into drugs. The whole story of Uncle Joe taking her after she opened the front door at 3 a.m. while mom was passed out drunk comes from her little sister, who was 4 at the time of the kidnapping. Only the sister didn't tell the cops that story until 5-ish years later. When you combine that plus all the inconsistencies of the mother's story, it seems like the mom helped her very young daughter develop a false memory of what actually happened. The idea of a mother allowing her child to be kidnapped for financial gain is probably the most disgusting thing I've ever heard. And even if that isn't the case, the fact that there was a 911 call and there was the note left in the diner just makes this feel like it was so close to being solved and she was so close to being saved, but it just never happened. I've actually heard of this case before, and it is very disturbing. If you'd like a deeper dive on this story, I will link a video by Kaylee Elise where she goes into incredible detail about what happened and possible theories about what actually went down. The disappearance of the Sauder children, Christmas Eve 1945. The Sauder family's home in Fayetteville, West Virginia burned to the ground. There's the father, George, the mother, Jenny, and 9 children. 4 of the children escaped, but 5 were believed to have died in the fire. Then, during the search of the burned house, none of the children's remains were found. The fire was nowhere near hot enough to burn through bone, but not a trace of them were found. Here's the freaky stuff. 2 months before, a visiting salesman told George his house would go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. The salesman attributed this to George's dirty remarks against Mussolini. George, an Italian immigrant, had been outspoken against Mussolini, which angered some of his Italian-American community. Another visitor later told George that his fuse boxes would cause a fire someday. This was after George had just had his electricity rewired and inspected to be safe. In the weeks before Christmas, the older Sauder children noticed a car following them through the main town as they walked home from school. During the night of the fire, Jenny was awoken by a strange phone call after midnight, asking for a name she did not know. At 1 a.m., Jenny heard a loud banging on the house's roof, but went back to sleep when she did not hear anything further. A half hour later, she smelled smoke. George, Jenny, and 4 of the children who had been sleeping downstairs escaped the house. They yelled to the children upstairs, but heard no response. The fire had already engulfed the staircase, so they could not rescue them. George tried to go outside around the house to use a ladder to climb the window to the attic and rescue the children, but the ladder was not in its usual place. It would be found 75 feet away in an embankment. Then George tried to drive both of his trucks to the window, then climb them, but neither truck would start despite both having worked the previous day. Later, a telephone repairman told the Sauders that the house's phone line had not been burned through in the fire as they had initially thought, but was cut by someone. The driver of a bus that passed through Fayetteville late Christmas Eve said he had seen some people throwing balls of fire at the house. Other witnesses claimed to have seen the children themselves. One woman who had been watching the fire from the road said she had seen some of them peering out of a passing car while the house was burning. Years later, in the 1960s, Jeannie found a letter in the mail addressed to her, postmarked in Central City, Kentucky, with no return address. Inside was a picture of a young man around 30 with features strongly resembling Lewis's, who would have been in his 30s if he had survived. On the back was written, "Louis Sauder, I love brother Frankie, I lil boys, A90 132 or 35. I'm not sure if that's a typo by the author of this post, or if that is an actual exact word for word what was said in the letter. The Sauders have never stopped believing their children were alive, and Jeannie wore black in mourning every day for the rest of her life. Regardless of the eyewitness testimony of fireballs being thrown at the roof, or the Sauder children being seen in a car while the house was burning, I do believe the evidence heavily points towards there being some aspect of foul play in this situation. This story is just as fascinating as it is heartbreaking, and I really implore you, if you'd like to know more about this situation and hear some of the theories from people in the true crime community who have spent a lot of time looking at this case, check out Kaylee Elise's video on the subject. I will put it in the description and in the comments down below. I hope you're all taking care of one another and staying safe out there. Make sure you're skating on to the best of your abilities and drinking more water, and I will see you very soon.